I am tremendously excited today because, ladies and gentlemen, this month at Manor Park Classics, we have a beige Austin Maxi. And this is absolutely my kind of automotive bread and butter. It's the bread and butter of my automotive taste, should I say. I just love all that British Leyland tat from the 1960s, 70s and 80s. And I mean that in the most endearing way. Just for a little bit of context as to that, we also have in this month an original Porsche 911. And it's a nice one too. It's Garbs red, it's got a Targa roof, it's even got a whale tail on the back. And I love old Porsches. I should love that car, and I do, but someone made the mistake of parking it next to a Mark I Vauxhall Cavalier. I've sat in the Cavalier and I haven't sat in the 911 yet. But if you were to put this car next to both of those, then it's the one from Cowley that I would be taking home. There's just something about the engineering, the development, the history of these cars that I just cannot get away from. And in recognition of that, I have a feeling that this video could drag on for some serious time. So first, I'll set out what we're going to do today. First, we will talk about why the Maxi exists, go into its story a little bit, its history, its development, and also its life. Figure out why exactly it looks as it does. Then we'll have a look around the car at some of its features, a little bit of its genius, and also some of its failings. And then, of course, we will go out for a drive as well. So the Austin Maxi was, of course, launched in 1969 and remained British Leyland's mid-size family car offering all the way through to the early 1980s. But it was 10 years before the car's launch in 1959 where the avenue towards the Maxi begins. The company, then known as BMC, launching the most influential car ever built, and a car that totally revolutionised the motor industry in the form of the Mini. Now, of course, I love the Mini, and we all know the Mini story. We've been through it 1,000 times before, so we won't labour the point. The short version is that Sir Alec Izagonis revolutionised the family car by fitting it with a transversely mounted engine with its gearbox in the sump, front-wheel drive. He then pushed the wheels as far into each corner of the car as possible, gifted it independent suspension all round, trailing arms at the back, double wishbones at the front, and in the process he created a TARDIS, 10 feet and 1/4 of an inch of motor car in which you could fit 4 proper full-size adults. You might be a little bit short on room for luggage, but the Mini was a revolution. Nobody had really seen a mass-market car designed with such finesse that achieved these engineering ideals. And of course, over the next however many decades, we realised that the Mini wasn't just a packaging revolution, something that influenced all front-engine, front-wheel drive cars from that point onwards, but also one that was fantastic to drive. Minis won rally championships and touring car championships all over the world, and they are still so loved today for their driving character. But the Mini was absolutely not a one-off. When it was launched in 1959, people viewed it as being slightly odd, but BMC, as the company was then known, realised that it was the right thing to do. They realised that this was the future of motoring. And so a few years later, in 1962, they launched the Mini's big brother, the Austin & Morris 1100. 2 years on from that, they launched the Austin & Morris 1800, giving us 3 new distinct Austin Morris products for the 1960s that were the most sophisticated family cars in the world at their launch. Within a few years, the Mini had also gained the suspension from the later 2 cars, Dr. Alex Moulton's hydroelastic system, which has no coil springs. Instead, it floats on fluid and it rides on rubber springs. These cars were incredible, and of course we all know the Mini today. The Mini name, of course, lives on. But the Mini was never Britain's best-selling car. Instead, that title was left up to the 1100, which was Britain's best-selling car from 1963 all the way through to the early 70s, barring 1 year, 1967, where it missed out. You could not say that these cars were anything other than a roaring success. The Austin 1800, however, wasn't quite that. It may have achieved Car of the Year in 1965. I've driven an 1800 and they are agile, they are nimble for such a big car, but they also ride like a cloud and they have all the room in them you could ever want. They are fantastic cars, but they didn't sell in great numbers. partly because the project was misguided and also because it ended up being a distinctly ugly car. But the 1800 was also a little bit too big. It had grown beyond its initial brief. So we have the Mini, of course, with its little 850cc engine. Then the 1100 with its 1100cc engine, and then a big gap up to the 1800. People weren't necessarily willing to pay that extra money for this extra space in this new Austin 1800. People didn't really need the front-wheel drive layout in a car of that size, and as I said, it ended up being really quite ugly. A couple of years before the 1800 was launched, however, Ford brought out the Mark I Cortina. Fords at the time were very conventional cars, rear drive, leaf springs, etc. They had nothing on the control, the ride quality, the finesse of BMC cars, but that meant that they were affordable and they were popular with fleet users as well, who really wanted that cheap to run character that Ford cars have, that due to their sophistication, the BMC offerings didn't quite have. As the 60s began to wear on, the Cortina was only growing in strength. I mentioned 1967 a moment ago, and that was the 1 year that the 1100 missed out to the Mark II Cortina, launched the previous year. As if only to complicate matters more, those rugged, dependable, reliable Fords were also very cheap to produce. After all, they didn't have the sophistication I've already mentioned of the BMC cars, and so Ford could sell them for huge profits. Austin and Morris products, on the other hand, had to compete on price with Ford's, but cost so much more to build, and therefore, at certain periods in the 60s, every single Mini and 1100 that was sold lost money. And the more they made, the more they lost. And it's a shame in that regard that they made so many of them. They were so popular. But with that big gap opening up, that very important family car market, BMC, as they morphed into British Leyland in 1968, realised that they needed to do something new. They needed to come up with a new mid-sized family car to really take on the Ford Cortina. And that is the thinking that birthed the Maxi. Dominating that 1500, 1600cc market segment is of course something that BMC never wanted Ford to do, but it was also originally envisioned for the 1800 to be a part of that market. The problem is that unlike the Mini and the 1100, which were very finely honed cars, the 1800 grew into something a little bit too sophisticated for its own good. So it used the much larger, if very smooth and very reliable B-Series engine, of course 1800cc's worth, but the car was originally slated to be fitted with a 1.6 litre B-Series engine, the kind you'd find in the old Austin Cambridge and Morris Oxford. The reason they felt they had to fit it with an 1800cc engine is because it grew a little bit too heavy. The Austin 1800, believe it or not, was actually smaller than the Mark I Ford Cortina, but it had so much more room inside, and so it felt like a larger car. And of course, it also drove like a larger car, what with its hydroelastic suspension and the power of that engine. But in pushing these boundaries, in changing the automotive industry, the Austin 1800 also did not have any subframes. Instead, BMC built the car so strong, so rugged, that it was amongst the safest cars in the world back in 1964, and it could support its own engine, its own suspension, front and rear, directly onto the body shell. Austin 1800s, or Land Crabs as they eventually became known, were mildly successful as rally cars in the really tough rallies like the Paris-Dakar, etc., because they would just keep going. As long as all the little fiddly bits kept going, of course. The shell itself was so strong and so rugged, and that made it heavy, hence the need for that larger engine. So when it came time to then design something that would sit in between 1100 and 1800 to truly take on the Ford Cortina, BMC then sat and realised that they didn't have any money. They'd spent all that money creating the 1800, which then didn't sell in great numbers. And all the money they did have was being whittled away by the loss-making Mini and 1100. So the Maxi was immediately on the back foot. BMC, British Leyland, whatever they were by this stage, had to tread very, very lightly indeed. And that brings us to the famous doors. Really quite early in the design process of the Maxi, some bright spark said that in order to save money, we must use the doors from the Austin 1800. A car that, as I said, was smaller than the Mark I Cortina, but was also quite ugly and ill-proportioned and had to be minimised to turn it into the Maxi. And that meant that immediately, before pen had even been put to paper in creating this new car, the angle of the windscreen, the general wheelbase of the car, the roof angle, and of course the side profile was already dictated to them from a car that wasn't very popular. And therefore a lot of people still today confuse the Austin 1800, the big executive Austin 3-litre and the Austin Maxi, all of which are totally different cars and share very little relatively in terms of their actual engineering, but because they share the doors, people are convinced they're the same. But no matter, we say, because of course they already have the engineering really kind of sorted out here. They could use that old 1600cc B-Series engine from the old Austin Cambridge and Morris Oxford, and as long as they keep the weight of the car down, it'll pull it along well enough, and I'm sure it probably would have done. But unfortunately the engineering folks decided they wanted something new. And so engineered specifically for the Maxi was an all-new modular engine known as the E-Series. This thing features an overhead camshaft and in this form, as 1750, has a single carburettor. But the E-Series was originally designed to be a 1500cc engine to match the Mark II Ford Cortina pound for pound. But by the time the Maxi was launched, the Mark III Ford Cortina was on its way, complete with a much greater variety of engines and much more width as well. So Ford caught BMC napping yet again. This four-cylinder version of the E-Series engine was always designed to be 1500cc, and you'll notice from the pictures here that it is incredibly compact within this engine bay. And that's because it was also designed to be a six-cylinder engine, a straight six, to go in, well, the 1800 body shell to produce the Austin 2200 and later to be used in the Princess as well. The E-Series was purposefully compact so that it could retain front-wheel drive transverse mounted while being a decent capacity straight six. But that meant that there was no room to expand when Ford designed 2-litre versions and up of the Mark III Cortina. So instead, British Leyland had to stroke this engine from 1500 to 1750cc, as we see with this particular Maxi. Part of the reason of designing an all-new engine for this car was partly to get a little bit more power, but was also to further modernise, to produce an overhead camshaft design that would be fizzy, that would be revvy like a lot of modern European engines. But by stroking it out to 1750, it turned into a low-rev, torquey chugger again. So maybe they shouldn't have bothered developing this new engine, and they should have saved the money, put the B-Series engine in it, and instead designed some new doors. It's all wrong. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And that's really quite what I love about these things. So that is the basic version of the story about the Austin Maxi. A car that shouldn't have had to exist in the first place, forced into existence by BMC's kind of lack of market foresight and a project getting slightly out of hand, getting a bit too heavy, a bit too big, and therefore needing a larger engine. And then when they came to actually design this new car, it again was misguided. It used old-fashioned doors, which dictated it had a very 1960s conservative appearance in a world that was turning towards Coke bottles. That Mark III Cortina, of which I've done a video on our channel here at Manor Park Classics a number of months ago, was all about flair, was all about visual sophistication, whereas the Maxi looked very boring in comparison, and some would say indeed ugly in its own right, due to the way they had to truncate the rear end of the car and also force the bonnet to be as short as possible in order to make it small enough to really compete with the Cortina. As I said a moment ago, it's all wrong, but of course that didn't stop British Leyland from also simultaneously making it brilliant in its own right. So at the time, the average family car in Britain was a 4-door saloon. The Maxi, on the other hand, was a 5-door hatchback. And in 1969, this was virtually unheard of. Now, sure, there were slightly more exotic European cars out there, such as the Renault 16, for example, but in terms of mass market cars that were sold in Great Britain, nothing had this kind of versatility, this saloon cum estate fashion that the Maxi ended up being known for. I mentioned earlier that the Austin 1800 was actually smaller than the Mark I Ford Cortina. And owing to the fact that this had to be slightly smaller than the 1800, though of course the doors are again that same size, this is really quite a lot smaller than a Mark II Cortina. It's smaller than a Mark III Cortina as well, of course. And yet, because of the way cars have grown over the years, this is smaller than many modern super minis. And owing to that genius Alec Izagonis engineering front-wheel drive, I have all the space in the world back here. This is such a comfortable place to be with these brown velour seats that are so squishy, so comfortable. And I have this immense glass house. In many ways, manufacturers have forgotten how to build cars that feel nice inside in spite of the 70s-ness of this car. This practicality is just incredible. But that then leads us, of course, to the Maxi's party piece. Being, as it was, an early hatchback, again, as BMC did with the Mini, they influenced the modern motor industry, and again, the Maxi undoubtedly influenced other manufacturers to eventually bring us hatchbacks. But in order to showcase the versatility of it, a party trick that the Maxi had was to fold down into a double bed. So if we come round to the front and hope these nearly 45-year-old seats aren't too solid and aren't too stuck, we can push them all the way forwards and we can pull up this lever and then push them all the way down. I think the seat should move a little bit further forward than I can just get it now, but with the seat folded down, we then go into the boot. And then if we just do these catches on either side, we have a bed. The most practical car in the world and the beginning of the hatchback revolution back in 1969, courtesy of the Austin Maxi. So yeah, front-wheel drive and 5 doors is all well and good. Wonderful, in fact. Unprecedented for 1969. But British Leyland, all that stuff bashing about in the boot, but British Leyland were only about to make things better, because the Maxi came as standard and I think was the first normal everyday family car in the world to come with 5 speeds as standard. The Maxi really was all the 5s. We have 5 doors, 5 seats potentially, and 5 gears. So if it was so clever, then why didn't people buy it? Now, of course, the styling is one thing. I totally understand that not everybody is going to be enamoured by the styling of this thing, and they may therefore want something like a Ford Cortina, for example. But the Maxi felt relatively dreary. And another thing that BMC cars have always had is not a very sporty driving position. This is very commanding, sure, and the pedals are nice and large, very easy, and then they're nicely placed and they are nicely weighted as well, but you feel like you're kind of on top of everything. This is something the Mini had and they failed to fix in all the larger cars. And I mentioned before how the ride quality on these things is amazing. Early Maxis, as you might expect from before, use Dr. Moulton's hydroelastic suspension. Of course, it doesn't have any coil springs, and the basic version of the way it works is that you have a rubber cone placed in each corner of the car, and the cone is then within a displacer which is full of hydroelastic fluid which remains independent side to side, but is then linked from each unit on the front to their corresponding one in the rear. What it means is that a Maxi kind of floats in a way, and it kind of anticipates the road ahead of it. That damping force going all the way around the car to deliver this very, very controlled, very flat ride. And the rubber cones, of course, do your springing. So that's all well and good, but it doesn't lead to a very sporty feeling. In a Mini, that's a little bit different because the Mini is a smaller car and it's more firmly sprung, but that means that a Maxi feels a little bit wallowy. Very comfortable certainly, but slightly wallowy. Yet the double wishbone front suspension, the trailing arms rear, and the inherent properties of Hydrolastic, especially with the damping, mean that actually it has a heck of a lot of handling ability. Maxis are really, really agile cars, as are all the BMC front drive things. They're really surprising when you drive them. You just figure out just how capable they really are, despite having such a comfortable ride. So really, showroom appeal must have really scuppered the Maxi. But additionally, we have some of the other factors. So this E-Series engine, this one feels lovely and smooth. It really is just pulling us along very nicely, very easily, no dramas whatsoever. But it felt nowhere near as eager, for example, as a larger 2-litre, for example, Pinto engine. And when Ford expanded the Cortina range and again caught BMC napping, BMC just didn't have an answer. The closest they could get was a twin carburettor version of the 1750 Maxi. And sure, that car made a lot of power. It made over 90 brake horsepower. But it just didn't feel as exotic as the Ford in many ways. So the Maxi was the thinking man's choice, really, whereas the Cortina was a lot cooler, a lot more youthful in its appearance. And then add to the fact that this interior feels a bit drab compared to the Mark III Cortina. This little 2-spoke steering wheel, for example, just doesn't have the sex appeal. And then we get to some worse qualities of the Maxi, like the gear change, which on the very early Maxis was operated by cables. That was then changed in 1970 in favour of the version in this car, the rod change, which is very similar in many ways to the kind of gear change used on later Minis, Metros, Allegros, those kind of cars. But it just lacks any kind of positivity, and that's such a shame. It's a bit like stirring something. It just doesn't have that accuracy that you get in a lot of rear drive Fords of this era. But that doesn't make it bad. It's just a different kind of car to a Cortina. But again, British Leyland's reputation then got the better of the Maxi. BL became known for building poor quality cars, and regardless of whether you got a good Maxi or a bad one, this one feels absolutely lovely and quite well assembled. You couldn't help the car's image. The car's image as being slightly pedestrian, being slightly old-fashioned, as being quite expensive to maintain, what with its complicated CV joints and all that kind of stuff. I feel it's a massive shame that the Maxi didn't sell in huge numbers. It was regularly in the UK top 10, but it didn't sell in the numbers that BL, of course, wanted of it, or that I feel it deserved. Because this car, it's nice to drive, it's beautifully comfortable, it has a 5-speed gearbox, it's incredibly practical, and I see no issue with the basic design. So there is our little drive in this very late Maxi 1, just before they facelifted the car for the last year or so of production, before eventually the Austin Maestro replaced these things. And there's a lot of genius going on. These cars are so sensibly designed in so many regards, and precede many modern family cars with its front engine, front drive layout, its 5-door body on it, and of course 5-speed gearbox as well, all before any of those things were even considered, never mind had become common as well. The Maxi is just a car I don't think gets the recognition it deserves. So if you like the look of this Maxi 1750L, Hydra Gas Maxi 1750L as well, which means that rather than having the rubber cones in the hydrolastic units, it instead has high pressure nitrogen gas doing your springing instead. If you do like the look of it, then do head over to our website and even come and have a look at this car for yourself before our auction on the 15th of February.